this video, I'll show you how to use BorisFx10 in Premiere Pro CS6. Hi, here I am in Premiere Pro CS6, and I've got a timeline set up which shows you some of the cool transitions you can make using BorisFx10, the newest version in a long line of BorisFx products. BorisFx10 includes 120 new filters as well as a whole new user interface. So I'm going to show you how to use BorisFx10 to create a custom transition of your own in just a minute. Okay, so again, these transitions you see here were all created using BorisFx10, and in fact, all of the ones from this point on are presets that ship with the product. So if you like any of these, you can actually load them yourself straight out of the box. And I'll show you where those are located later in the video. What I'm going to start with is showing you how to create a custom transition from scratch. This first one right here. I like to call this kind of the waking up transition. Dreaming about water and then realizing he's still stranded in the desert. Too bad. Okay, so let's get started. I've got a clean timeline here, just the two clips. And BorisFx can be used as a filter or a transition. So I can just drag it in between these two clips. Notice how it's using the outgoing and incoming clip on the same track, so I don't have to layer anything. And it loads this kind of stock flip transition. It's just a placeholder. We don't expect you to use it. To customize the filter, go into the Customize button here, and that will launch the BorisFx user interface. Now, BorisFx is actually a standalone application which you can run outside of Premiere, but it's the same thing you see here. And if you're totally new to it, it's a compositor with its own set of filters and transforms. And if you're familiar with BorisFx, then this could still look brand new because it is brand new. We've fully redesigned the layout. It's totally customizable now, how the windows are set up. You can move them around anywhere you want. You can even float them into different windows. And we include a whole bunch of workspaces that you can switch between too. But for now, I'm going to work in the default setting, and we'll take it from here. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to use is one of these new filters, and I'm going to use a transition, BCC lens transition. This emulates the look of an out-of-focus camera using shutter leaves and bokeh. And since it's a transition, I don't have to create keyframes for this effect. I can just go into the Controls tab here, where it says Animation, tell it to be Auto. And that will automatically start and end the effect for the duration of the timeline. If you want manual control, we offer that too, but let's make it as easy as possible, shall we? Alright, so that's all I have to do for the transition part of this effect. I'm going to disable animate mode and make some changes to the lens blurs themselves. For example, I want to make them larger, and I'm using on-screen controls to change the filter, which is another new feature in BorisFx10. I'm going to boost the highlights so they stand out a little more, lower the threshold, suppress the threshold just a bit, and soften as well. Next, I'm going to change the mode to RGB glow to keep more of the color in the blurs. Looks good. And lastly, I'm going to make some changes to the iris. I'm going to make it a circle instead of a hexagon and put some shading into the bokeh, like so. Okay, and that is all I have to do to set up my lens transition effect. Now there is one thing you may have noticed, and that is that it's not transitioning to my incoming clip. Well, if I twirl down here the lens transition tab, I have incoming layer, which I will change from V1 to V2. And now it shows my incoming clip. And at this point, if I apply back to Premiere, I have a nice lens transition. At this point, I also want to point out that say I want the transition to take longer, I can actually do that from Premiere by just extending the duration in Premiere. BorisFx will automatically scale itself to match the new timeline. And that works in both directions. I can lengthen or shorten the transition, and BorisFx compensates perfectly. So that's a really handy feature that you don't have to reanimate in the BorisFx interface to make those changes. Okay, now let's add those other effects. So that was my lens transition part of it. I'm going to move this above video 1 in the timeline. It's still going to have the same effect it did before, but now, should I make changes to video 1, it won't affect the lens transition part. Okay, so let's move on to adding the ripple, and that was an FEC effect called Easy Lazy Waves. So here it is, and at the moment it looks very different from how it did in my final product, so let's make some changes so that it matches. Okay, we're going to start at the beginning and turn on animate mode again. When this key is red, every change you make will create a keyframe in the filter. So, for example, I want to undistort the filter to start. That way it doesn't start ripply, so it's going to act more like a transition now. Same thing at the end. I'm going to increase undistort to 100%. So now it's like there's no distortion at all, so going into the middle of my whole thing, bring that back down to 0. And now I have the ripples coming just in the middle of the sequence as if it's a transition. The reason I have to do all this is because this is a filter, unlike lens transition, which was actually a transition. Okay, so I made some keyframes, and let's say I want to change them. Well, that's another new feature in BorisFx10. First of all, if I go into Smart View and select the animated parameter, and then click on this button, Show Graph View. This shows me my keyframes in graph mode, so I can make changes to them visually. So I can adjust handles this way, I can reposition keyframes, I can even add keyframes just by clicking on the graph. So this is a very powerful editing tool. It's going to allow me to work very quickly in terms of fine-tuning the animation. For example, I do want to get to the distortion faster and have it taper off more gradually, even faster. Okay, almost going to go for a linear interpolation at the end, and maybe end it just ahead of the transition. So I'm going to control click to add a keyframe and set that one to 100. So I don't even need this one anymore. And set this to hold. So I can change all these things from the graph view directly. Okay, next let's go into the speed of the waves, and this is a change which I don't want to animate. But I don't have to constantly switch back and forth between animate and static mode, because once I've created a keyframe, if I select it, I can just change the interpolation to be constant. And now note that it's the same thing the whole time. And now that the waves are faster, they're easier to see. Another note about graph view: if I only select one parameter at a time, I only see one graph. But if I select a higher level, I can see all of the keyframes at once. And that's a feature I can enable or disable. Okay, that does it for easy, lazy waves. Next, I added a BCC effect called Colorize Glow. And this is another case where it's an effect, so we have to animate it to look like a transition. So we're going to start with an intensity of 0, again using the on-screen controls, and it's going to end with an intensity of 0. In the middle, let's give it an intensity of 50 or so. Next, I'm going to add a color preset. Blues should do. But I don't want it to be blue when he's waking up, so I'm going to animate the hue of this also. So going into the Gradient HSL tab, I'm just going to create a keyframe on the hue by selecting Linear. That should create a keyframe right here. Then I'm going to go forward a bit, and let's make it more red. And this will be a hold keyframe as well. Very nice. Okay, now I do want to make some fine-tune adjustments to the animation of the intensity here. First of all, I want it to be more spread out, and I want it to start later, and I want it to end earlier. Okay, and let's see if there's just anything more I can do to the blur amount. Again, this is something I'm going to make constant, and I don't need graph view anymore. Collapse these up, and that should do it. So returning back to our host just to check, and let's preview it. Okay, so it came out good. It's a little bit shorter than it was before, so no problem. I just drag it out to where I want it to end and then render it. And perfect. Okay, now that I've gone through the process of creating a transition from the ground up, let me show you a shortcut. First of all, let's go back into the BorisFx interface and let's save what I've done. And I'm going to select Save Project, Copy to Library. So if you check your folder hierarchy, you want this to go into one of the keyframe library subfolders, preferably Transitions. And I'm going to call this Waking Up 2. Okay, now what is the library? The library browser is where we keep all of our best projects that we ship with the product. So I'm going to move this window around so you can see it. So you see all these categories and folders here. These are all presets. Actually, they're projects that you can open. For example, this damaged TV filter transition is one I used in the other timeline. And I can play it and see how it looks with my current video. And if I don't like that, I can just select any of these. Here's the kaleidoscope preset that I used. So we have all of these different presets that you can just open at the push of a button. So there's over 100 of these to choose from. A lot of them are brand new, so if you already had BorisFx10 or earlier, some of these presets are worth the price of upgrading by themselves. This is a really good one, Blur Dissolve. And of course the one that I just saved is here too, in the Transitions category, Waking Up 2. If you want to generate thumbnails, just click on this button right here, and it will generate the thumbnails for all of the presets using the video you have in your timeline. And there it is. Now to make this workflow even faster, go into template mode. From this point on, every time I open BorisFx, I'll just see the library browser. And that lets me choose just presets and apply them from Premiere. So maybe now I want to do a swish pan transition, something like horizontal blur, and there it is. And if I don't like it, just pop right back in, choose another one. So you can see how quick and easy it is to create a sequence like this when all you need to do is change whatever preset you're using. So that makes BorisFx a great tool for creating custom transitions, as well as other things which I just didn't have time to show you today. Okay, and that's it. So if you liked what you saw here and want to try it yourself, go to our website and you can download a free trial version, and that's at BorisFx10.com.